Hello, welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking about Cubism, Chapter 7. We have one more lecture tomorrow, Chapters 8 and 9. There will be a review that I will share for Thursday, and your first test covering Chapters 1 through 9 will be Friday. And remember, keep in mind you can use your notes for the test. It's open note, but it is not open book. It is not open internet. So take good notes. I'll also give a bit of a review to help you hone in on what will be critical to the test. So here are the questions for today. And remember, when you're answering your questions, I really want it to be reflective of the experience of reading the chapter and then taking notes from the lecture. I think some of you are maybe caught up too much in getting the right answer, and it's sometimes just a few sentences or a few thoughts about the idea is coming from your perspective is fair, is good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect textbook example, or in other words, I think some of you perhaps are Googling to make sure you're right after you look at the lecture, after you looked at the PowerPoint and watch the recording, but it's actually better if it's, sometimes Google will steer you wrong with the wrong answer. So these are the questions for today. We're going to be talking about Picasso, we're going to be talking about Cubism and the roots of Cubism and this very modern art movement. I think a lot of times, talking about Picasso, he is such an enigmatic figure, but also sort of a heroic, larger-than-life figure, becomes sort of a name, Picasso, and synonymous with creativity and breaking with tradition. But in some ways, his work is very traditional. We'll talk about that today as well. But I think Picasso becomes a really defining figure for kind of the confounding aspects of modern art, the inspirational ideas of modern art, how modern art can be both complex, hard to understand, but also easy to understand at the same time. So I think he's a really interesting sort of case study for modern art because he's such a great example of so many of the different aspects or layers of modern art. And his career, even early on, touches on so many different movements and inspirations and influence that we've already looked at. One of the things the chapter talks about is mimesis, or how throughout art history, in particular in the Renaissance tradition and the tradition of neoclassicism and also Romanticism, that mostly art has been worried about getting nature correct. And then with abstraction and with modernism, there's sort of a shift away from representational or objectiveness. But what's interesting about Picasso is that he never completely leaves that expectation. A lot of his work is still traditional for various reasons that we'll explore today. The traditions of subject matter, the traditions of seeing things, all right? And one of Picasso's great quotes is, "Art is a lie that helps us to understand the truth." So he's still after that truth, one of those Platonic ideals that Plato talked about. Art should in some way mimic nature or be natural. First of all, Picasso was born in the southern part of Spain. He was born in the town, very provincial town of Malaga in the southern part of Spain. He identified as Catalan even though he was born in the southern part. He really liked the industrialized, sophisticated city of Barcelona, and he lived in Barcelona as a teenager. His father was an art professor and taught at the Barcelona School of Fine Arts. And this is one of his father, Jose Ruiz, is Picasso's father, one of his works. He did a lot of studies on birds, and you can see kind of the Spanish influence. Picasso was influenced by Velázquez, who he studied his works. So at first, and actually, a lot of times people will talk about Picasso as being so good at drawing that it made his father quit and retire early. He stopped. He said, "There's no way I can make art. I'm not going to be able to make art as good as my son at the age of like 15." So he quit making art. He sends Picasso to continue his studies. So he started at Barcelona School of Fine Arts, where his father was teaching. He sends him to the Royal Academy, and then also spent some time in Madrid. But the whole time he was thinking about going to Paris, because at the time, even if you're not in school in Paris, that's where the majority of the artists were. Artists like Matisse. Remember thinking about artists like Van Gogh, Gauguin. A lot of them lived at some point in Paris, and that's a real art mecca or art center. So he was influenced by the artists that were working there at the time. You can see his emphasis on Munch, symbolism, works that were important at the time, kind of from the Spanish tradition, like Velázquez. Velázquez is sort of like Rembrandt, but in the Spanish tradition. He studied the kind of Spanish old masters at the Prado Museum. Then when he moves to Paris, he's influenced by his friends, by the art that he sees there, eventually Matisse. But this is his very famous blue period. He became friends with a fellow painter and lived with him for a while when he was in Paris. His name was Carlos Casagemas. And this is actually a portrait of his friend, Carlos Casagemas. Carlos Casagemas died by suicide. He was struggling with anxiety and had an unrequited love. He loved someone that didn't love him back. And so when Picasso was not with him, Carlos Casagemas killed himself in front of friends. And so he was in Paris by himself when he did that without Picasso. Picasso was traveling. And it really shook Picasso to his core. Picasso has described his blue period as both expressionistic, but also introspective. Something that, obviously the expressiveness of the color blue, that's why we call it blue period, but also think about getting the blues. So this is Pablo Picasso's early work that is very inspired by art that's going around him at this time. It's not necessarily all that groundbreaking, but I tell you what, if Picasso did nothing else but the blue period and the rose period, he would still be an important figure in art history. It's that he becomes the most important, perhaps, of the 20th century because of what he does after this in about 1907. But he is doing a portrait here of his friend Carlos, who at the time had already killed himself. Here is his friend Carlos Casagemas. Here is both his young lover here, and perhaps here as well, kind of the future self of her holding a baby. And here it's very kind of modern. You can see they are nude. It's expressionistic. But here this is almost religious, the way that he depicts her later. If she has a child, that child will not know its father, right? And even though artwork, and this is called La Vie, which means life, and he's just like, it's a celebration of life, but it's also somber and morose and depressed because his friend no longer is alive. You can see Picasso's sketches and studies for this work and other works here. He literally painted these, became other canvases. This painting here on the right, and he changed this multiple times. He even included a portrait of himself in this, but did multiple sketches for La Vie where it changes. And that's one of the main things about Picasso's work too, is he continues to change, go back to paintings, change the way that someone looks or adds an element, adds a character, takes a character away. And it's interesting because he actually, used his friends as models in a lot of his works, which we'll talk about. And in the right here, this portrait of this woman was a drawing that he did of an inmate who was a prostitute who had a venereal disease, and so you can kind of see the sense of life even being drained from her. So this is an ironic title, and a title that's really embedded with a lot of meaning, La Vie, or life. This is a painting that Pablo Picasso did of his friend Carlos Casagemas, and you can see the influence of Van Gogh. He wasn't entirely inventive at this period. He was very much indebted to other artists and, in a way, appropriating and copying the things that other artists were doing before he kind of found his own style, his own unique style. But I just wanted to show you this. This is a portrait of his friend Carlos Casagemas, who died at a really, really young age, which is very unfortunate because he had a very promising art career. This is a self-portrait that Carlos Casagemas did at the turn of the century, and it's an etching. I just wanted to show you this, an example of his work, and you kind of see how Picasso was able to get his kind of his facial qualities here. Self-portrait by Carlos Casagemas, great friend of Picasso's, died by suicide, inspired Picasso's Blue Period. This is a really well-known work as well. This is early in Picasso's career. He's still kind of trying to find his own signature style. And this is a combination. It's a charcoal drawing and watercolor painting. Sometimes works become very personal to people, and I feel like I kind of own this piece, even though I don't really own it. I kind of feel like this is my Picasso, because notice where it's at. It's at the Toledo Museum of Art. I used to teach at the University of Toledo at the Center for Visual Arts, and it was literally attached to the Toledo Museum of Art. And so if I was talking about Picasso, I could literally take my students from class and walk down to the museum and say, hey, here's this Picasso piece that we're talking about in person. Beautiful piece. You can see the influence of the symbolist artists like Odilon Redon, the French artist. But in this sense, he's still kind of figuring out what his own style is or is going to be. This comes from his Rose period, so in the next phase is a little more positive, a little more upbeat. It's interesting because he uses these circus performers, these saltimbanques, these Italian and Spanish known kind of tradition of these clownish characters that would go around and perform. He did this as a way of, in a way, being self-referential. They were about him and his friends. In a way, he used these saltimbanques as proxies for artists in the artist class, who a lot of times were living really poverty-stricken lives, waiting for their next sale, hoping for a sale, begging for scraps, essentially, similar to these performers who had to put on a facade that they were happy, but really destitute in many cases, poor. And it's interesting because he doesn't show them as in the middle of their activity. They're not performing. They're actually doing kind of daily activities, getting food, getting water, and going about their day, and not even interacting with one another. They seem devoid of emotion, and they don't seem to be interacting with one another. They're in their kind of own mental headspace. We're not sure who some of the figures are, but we do know for sure that Picasso included himself in this very famous family of saltimbanques, and he is this harlequin feature member right here. Self-portrait in profile, really interesting. This is from his Rose period. We can see the influence of Cézanne as well, and artists like Van Gogh still, but also looking back at some of the old masters like Rembrandt and Velázquez, who he would have seen their work in the museums and copied them. He actually did old master studies, and later in his career he revisited those as well. Really interesting sense of color. Fauvism was popular right at the time, but his color is a little more subdued, and we call it, the Blue period because of the colors, because of the depressing aspects. We call this the Rose period because he was literally painting with brighter colors, but they're still a little bit subdued. They're more pastels. Like, imagine that all of the colors have been tinted with white or with gray, so they have more of a pastel kind of vibe to them. So this is sort of a metaphor for his own life as sort of being a performer, and one that he revisits even when he's not talking about those circus performers, that there's this sort of bravado or acting aspect of being an artist. One of the most influential members of Picasso's circle, now he hung around with a lot of poets and a lot of writers, a lot of artists, even actors. And one of those was Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was very influential. A lot of times people talk about how she was a collector of art and sort of would organize these salons, these intellectual events where people would come over to her apartment and talk about art, do little plays, act one scene short plays, read poems. Apollinaire was one of the poets that hung around. But not a lot of people talk about her influence as a figure. Okay, so she was really important. Early feminist, before feminism was truly, really, really a thing and defined. The aspect of women's rights, but equality of women, and that women were artists and writers in their own respect. I mean, think about the century before this. Artists had to pretend they were men to sneak into the academy. Female writers oftentimes had to take fake male pen names, pseudonyms, to be able to publish their writings. Gertrude Stein is saying that women are equal to men. And her writing is very interesting because she did a lot of the same things in the written arts that Picasso later does in the visual arts. A really good example of that is a book that she wrote called Tender Buttons, that is a sort of cut and paste, collage-like series of poems that's fractured, that kind of take words out of context and rearrange them. She does that before Picasso does that in his painting. So she becomes a really influential figure. I don't think enough people give her credit for what her art and what her ideas adds to her circle of friends, including Matisse, who she introduces to Picasso. And remember, Gertrude Stein bought the Joy of Life painting by Matisse, who in about 1907, Gertrude Stein introduced first Matisse's work to Picasso and then later introduced the two of them. They meet and create this really lively, productive, prolific rivalry, right, of kind of trying to one-up one another. So this is, Gertrude Stein said that she sat for Pablo Picasso for about 90 different sittings, but eventually what he did is he just painted it from memory anyways. And he creates this sculptural likeness of Gertrude Stein, and here we can see it in her study. This is Gertrude Stein. You can see the painting in the background. You can see other works by Picasso and Matisse in her study. And this is a photograph of her with this painting in the background. Shows her as being really stoic, but really also sort of, I think, proud and respected, like almost like an elder statesman in this group, because Picasso really looked up to her, and others did as well. Gertrude Stein really introduces a lot of people, rich, wealthy donors, first in Paris and London, and then in the United States. And you can see this piece in and of itself was donated to the Met Museum, where you can go and see it. Beautiful painting, and it was given to the Met by Gertrude Stein. So you can kind of think about her patronage as being really important, sort of like thinking about people like the Medicis and the Renaissance, who basically made this art possible. Think about that. Had Picasso and Matisse not met Gertrude Stein, where would their work have ended up? Picasso had to destroy some of his work, cheaply sell some of his work just to survive, and a lot of times those works don't last. Now you get your work into an important collection like Gertrude Stein that later ends up in a museum, it gives you a lot of credibility as an artist, right? So she becomes very important in these circles. Here we see Picasso's work really starting to turn a corner and be new. He was influenced by his own roots, studying those old masters, particularly Spanish old masters in the Prado Museum in Madrid, but also seeing works like Michelangelo's sculptures, Greek sculptures, and this is very much Spanish. Even though this is a painting of a figure, it looks sculptural. It looks much more three-dimensional. He's trying to make them look stiff and solid, really three-dimensional forms, just like a Michelangelo sculpture or just like a Greek sculpture that he's referencing here. The nude, especially in this sense, But he's also looking at Greek vases, the paintings that were on Greek vases, and Iberian sculptures, which would have been Iberian sculptures were the Iberian Peninsula, part of Spain. And so that's how his work is sort of traditional. He's looking at old art, but he's trying to find a new form, a new way of representing it. And this is called Two Nudes, but essentially it's just one nude. It's kind of one figure looking at themselves in the mirror. And this theme is something that we see a lot in Picasso's work. It's sort of like a duality. It's inner, it's outer, it's kind of introspective, but it's also being, in a way, extroverted. We see that in his work a lot, whether it's the female form, his own form, you see later in Picasso's work as well. And it's also based on Matisse's work. So at this time, he's introduced to Matisse's work, and he's inspired by the forms of Fauvism, but not necessarily the color. It's a beautiful work. I think if we never get Cubism, this is still kind of searching for Cubism in a way. It's really, really interesting. Here's an example of an Iberian sculpture that Picasso actually owned. He had this piece, but he realized later that it had been stolen by the Louvre. So he returned it in 1911, which is interesting because 1911 is the same year that the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre, and one of the suspects that people thought perhaps may have stolen the Mona Lisa from the Louvre was Pablo Picasso and his Paris friends. Wasn't true, but hey, here's kind of why. He had come into possession of a stolen Iberian sculpture from the southern part of Spain. This is from like the 6th century BCE. Kind of looks somewhat Greek. It was influenced by Greek art, but very, very uniquely Iberian. And look at the eyes of this sculpture and the hands, how kind of thick and chunky and not really well articulated. They're rounded forms. We can see that in these painted works that Picasso does as well. So he returns this. So people felt at the same time, hey, he had this stolen sculpture from the Louvre. Maybe he stole the Mona Lisa. That's part of the reason the Mona Lisa becomes the most famous painting of all time, too, as well, is because for a year while it was stolen, there was an empty space, and people would start to come visit the empty space where the Mona Lisa used to be. Became very, very famous as a result. But here you can see how his work is influenced by Iberian sculpture. The most important painting, hands down, the 20th century is this painting by Picasso. There's just so much that happens in this painting that influence what comes after it. This is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which means the women of the street d'Avignon. It was made in 1907, but not shown until 9 years later in 1916. His friend Derain said he was worried that one day he would find Picasso strung up next to this painting. This painting was so shocking. His friend George Braque said that this painting was like drinking gasoline and spitting fire. Man, that is some positive, but also really, just cutting edge praise given on this painting by Picasso. Sometimes people refer to this as the first Cubist painting, but that's a bit of a misnomer. It's basically like a prototypical Cubist painting because Cubism wasn't a thing yet. Braque, his friend, which we'll talk about, really develops Cubism, but he was inspired by this painting. George Braque and Picasso became friends this year, 1907. They would visit each other's studios. He sees this work. This work is monumental. It is huge. So this is at the MoMA in New York. I hope you have an opportunity to see it at some point. 8 foot by 8 foot, right? So it's larger than life. Each one of these figures, and we see 5 nude female forms, are all life-size. They're all 6 to 7 feet tall. So when you walk into this, it's like you're walking into this space. But what about this space? Let's talk about this space a little bit. It's not quite three-dimensional. It doesn't look like a realistic space. I mean, there's people standing in a room. There's curtains, right? It looks like this figure right here is walking into the room, joining these 4 other figures. This figure here is seated, but it's a weird compressed space, kind of fighting 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional aspects. Here you're curving back the curtain. And in earlier variations of this painting, Picasso had a self-portrait that he was with these figures, but this is a portrait of women in a brothel. And Picasso had, lived in a region in Barcelona on Avignon Street, where the title comes from, which, by the way, Picasso didn't title this painting. Someone else did. He rarely titled his own works. So he lived in Barcelona for a little while near this district, which was a brothel or a red light district. He knew it very well. He knew it intimately well, but he also equated women with sexual violence. That is, venereal diseases, STDs, and sort of trauma. He had this suspicion of women as being evil, as being carriers of disease, which is really ironic because it's only through the act of, sex, men and women, that these diseases spread. It's not the women necessarily. In some ways, they're just, they're part of this overall process. But Picasso and others at this time saw it as the negative sexual violence of women, as being femme fatales, beautiful but also carriers of disease. And you can see he had done earlier paintings of the faces, these prostitutes, and then he covered them. Remember, and I shared an article about Matisse, who started to collect African objects, and Picasso was aware of this, and he started to look at African objects as well in the ethnographic museums. And he said that they were really inspirational, some of the most beautiful, pure art that exists. So a lot of times people refer to these two figures here as being African masks. However, it's my theory and one of my professor's theories that this is actually an oceanic mask here, which we can see if we compare it to, look at this. This is an oceanic mask from Tahiti that Gauguin studied while he was there, this very famous self-portrait. And Picasso would have been inspired by that. So Gauguin was looking at oceanic art. Matisse and others were looking at African art. And we can also see an indication of Iberian art here, but also Egyptian, because here the eye looks frontal, but the face is in profile. So kind of Egyptian and Iberian, African, perhaps oceanic, cultural influences. And at the same time, you have colonialism, you have uprisings in West Africa fighting against these colonizers. And in some ways, Picasso is pointing to that. He's not necessarily giving us an answer of what's right and wrong, the morality of colonialism, but he's saying, look at what the social reality is in these places. He's sort of giving us the fact. He's sort of giving us the truth. How is this a traditional painting? How is this painting traditional? I think at first we're shocked by how new and cutting edge and avant-garde it is. But if you had to question in what ways does it fit in with art history, well, you can see in some ways, and I hope that you notice this, it's very traditional in its portraits. It's not pure abstraction. It's still portraits. It's about something. It's subject matter. Here we see a still life, kind of like think about Adam and Eve, right? Like the temptation of fruit. Here we see a still life of fruit. So it's still life. It's a bit of, portrait. It's traditional in the sense that it's still trying to fit within the history of pictorial, tradition and art history. How is it experimental? Well, the fractured forms are so unique. They even seem threatening, like, yeah, this seems like she's holding perhaps a blanket. And in other cases, maybe this is sky, maybe this is the landscape, or perhaps it's part of this backdrop here. It's curious. It's doing something new with the forms, and it's really breaking apart the forms. There's no way that a woman could be sitting in this position, but also like seen from behind, but also her head turned 180 facing towards us. So it's this new kind of experience. It's this new way of representing, which leads us into Cubism. And Cubism was really created by George Braque first. This was a painting that was inspired by Matisse's Blue Nude. that we looked at before, which was inspired by Northern African art. And here you can see, you know, a tradition of representing a female form and beauty, but being avant-garde, being experimental, because it doesn't have to look like nature. It doesn't have to look objective, even though Braque and Picasso were really great at drawing things anatomically correct. They were being fast and loose with the facts because they were inspired by African art. They were inspired by Matisse, the Fauvists, and others, and they were trying to do something more modern, which we'll get into as well. But George Braque had an exhibition, and Matisse he was the juror for that exhibition, and he described Braque's work as being those little cubes, and that name stuck. So this, for instance, he showed his work to Picasso. Picasso saw this painting in 1908. The jury in this progressive show, so an avant-garde exhibition, thought even this work was too avant-garde. Matisse referred to Braque's paintings as little cubes, which we can see here. A few years later, Picasso and Braque have an exhibition together, and Braque exhibited a number of paintings. And in the catalog, the poet Apollinaire wrote about those works. He remembered Matisse's nickname of saying that these were paintings of Braque's little cubes, and he coins the phrase cubism. Why is it cubism? Well, it's a new way of seeing. Yes, it's based on little cubes, but it's also kind of fracturing the world. And at the beginning of this chapter, the book talks about Henri Bergson, who was a philosopher who wrote about the nature of consciousness, i.e. how we perceive things, in a book called Matter and Memory. And one of the things that he talks about is that we never really see things from one static viewpoint. It's more of an accumulation of experiences, and our perception is influenced by things changing over time. Boom, that's brilliant. That's what Picasso and Braque were essentially doing with their artwork. So this was rejected by that salon. Matisse was one of those people that didn't like it, and it was supposed to be part of a progressive avant-garde show, and it was too avant-garde. They thought it was too simple. How is it traditional? Well, it's sort of like Cézanne. Here at this point, Braque was inspired by Picasso's painting La Demoiselle d'Avignon, and how he fractured the composition into different little shapes and sections. So he starts to paint in that way as well, takes it a step further, invents Cubism. This is truly the first Cubist painting, Houses at l'Estèque, and this was painted in 1908. And you can see he's breaking apart the forms. Similar to Cézanne, but with Cézanne, he was trying to, remember, create something more solid, more stable. This doesn't feel solid. This feels more like we're walking through a space and seeing things. Maybe this is the same house shown a bunch of different ways. Maybe it's a village of a lot of different houses, but we can kind of imagine walking through this space and seeing different sides of the house at one time. The roofs don't line up, and sometimes the roofs themselves disappear into different forms in and of themselves. They just kind of dissolve. And so it's this way of kind of seeing things from not a static perspective using linear perspective, but seeing things from multiple perspectives. Picasso saw that painting. He had started this painting, Three Women, and actually it's similar to three of the women here in his painting, the very famous, and this painting again was too shocking. This painting was actually exhibited before his Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. But he takes three of those figures and he fractures them. They seem to be sleeping. They're in more of a slumber. They're not awake. They're more faceless and nameless. It doesn't matter who they are. They seem kind of masked. And this space is influenced by the works of Braque. This is the start of analytic cubism and begins a great productive relationship between Braque and Picasso. Now, I say here he's trying to attempt to one-up Braque, but really he's inspired by Braque, and Braque and him share ideas, talk about ideas, visit each other's studio, give each other critiques and input on how to make their paintings better, to represent time, to represent movement, and to represent this aspect of multiple perspectives. Think about it this way. If you're remembering a conversation with someone, you might remember the nature of the conversation as opposed to every single word. And you're going to remember perhaps certain things that you did, where you were at when you think about that conversation, maybe some of the sights, the smells, what you were eating, but you won't just remember it as one kind of static scene, the way that we have throughout history experienced painting in art history. So in other words, what Picasso and Braque were starting to do was trying to show that sense of memory, of experience, but showing it from multiple perspectives, right? So as a conversation develops, that you can have a passing of time and of movement and perspective, right? Layered all into one compressed space. This painting becomes very important because it inspires the next movement into Cubism. For a few years, they were doing what was called analytic Cubism, which we talked about. Analytic Cubism means a copying of reality from 1909 to 1911. They were really interested in analytic Cubism. They nicknamed it this because they were trying to analyze things. So this was a painting in 1909 that uses trompe-l'oeil. What does trompe-l'oeil mean? Trompe-l'oeil means to trick the eye. It's a French term in art history meaning to make something look illusionistic so that it tricks the person into thinking something that is two-dimensional is actually three-dimensional. Well, where do we see trompe-l'oeil in this painting? We see it in this nail here. This is his palette. For whatever reason, a lot of times the artwork was very traditional in that it was subject matter that was very traditional, like still lifes, portraits, landscapes like we just saw, very traditional in that sense, but very experimental in it's breaking those forms apart and trying to see it from multiple perspectives. So here we see the artist included, this is about a violin, it's about music. You can see the violin kind of fractured down here. You see the notation, the music notation here. And then you see this palette using trompe-l'oeil. It has the nail and the shadow of the nail, so it creates this sense of three-dimensional space. And this inspires this using the music notation to make it mimetic, like Plato described the goal of art is to look like nature. Well, Braque and Picasso are still doing that, but they want it to look like nature, but also represent a 360-degree view and a passing of time. This inspires the next period in Cubism, which we'll talk about in a bit, which becomes synthetic Cubism, which we'll talk about. So here's Picasso's Girl with a Mandolin. Here you can see, a theme of music that Braque does. Here Picasso's also doing a theme with music. And I think when you first look at Cubist works, they looked very, very abstract. But as you start to look at it and recognize the language that they were using and what they wanted you to experience, you can see the figure, you can see the girl, you can see the mandolin. You almost get a sense of sights and sounds and smells being in this space, a passage of time and of movement. And remember, it comes from that Henri Bergson, that philosopher quote, that experiences and our perception are based on accumulations of experiences. In other words, no rational being can ever experience a single instant of time. The past, the present, and future are not separate moments of awareness, but an unbreakable continuum, kind of from start to finish, thinking about a successive layer of images and experiences all onto one compressed space, which I think is beautiful. So you can see how this is influenced by that philosophy, but you can also see how Picasso would have never done this had it not been for the experiments of Braque and how they were linking ideas. So like I mentioned, that aspect of trompe-l'oeil that we see in this painting, with the music notation, the composition that's here, the palette. So palette, right, like the artist palette, like what the artist would use to mix paint on. He's actually included that. So it's kind of like the art is about art and art is about the process of making it. I think it's just really brilliant. But that trompe-l'oeil, that kind of fooling the eye, tricking the eye, that fiction creates this inspiration where this is the first painting to include actual collage in it. So the first painting in history to include actual real elements in it. And it's collaged. So collage means to glue. Collier in the French means to glue. And here we see a reproduction of chair caning, which would have been a cheaply produced like in a magazine or like a fake shelf lining paper, a mechanical reproduced image that he collaged onto the canvas on around this kind of oval canvas. And it also has, it's called still life with chair caning because this is a popular pattern, cane chairs. And also it has his oilcloth, his rag that he would use to clean his brushes off, or to, maybe he has a little errant mark on the painting, he would blend it with a rag, or he included the rag itself as part of composition. So part of the art process becomes part of the finished piece. It has an actual piece of rope glued to the canvas as well. And this is supposed to mimic the experience of dining. So imagine that we're looking at a table, and instead of the table being like this that we would sit at, the table is flipped up, and it's a clear glass table, and we can see, for instance, a mug here that had tea in it and a slice of lemon on that. We can see a napkin. We can see a bit of here, perhaps a plate and a glass, silverware. Here, a journal, like a newspaper that's laid out on this. And then underneath it, where nothing is covering this clear glass table, like imagine in a Paris cafe, we can see part of the chair that we're sitting on pushed underneath that table. So this is very, very abstract, but the more you look, the more you see. Anytime the more you look at art, the better you're going to understand it. You can start to recognize that this is actually trying to represent something very traditional, and that's a still life. It's even titled Still Life with Chair Caning. It has the letters J-O-U on it, which is pretty cool too, because we see in some of these works how there's a layer of two-dimensional versus three-dimensional, right? Like the music notation here is kind of the 2D aspect, but we see the 3D aspects of trompe-l'oeil here, which influences Picasso using these different elements. And this is kind of painted on, this is collaged on, and so it's, again, it's like a mix of trompe-l'oeil and actual items. This is where we get the word synthetic cubism from. It's a collage of elements. It's some real and some created fiction or synthetic elements. The J-O-U comes from Le Journal, which was a French newspaper, but it's also a play on words. Picasso was really famous for his play on words. So jouer in French means to play. So here he's playing with the elements of art, and the elements of the cafe table. And this is really emblematic of what then shifts next into synthetic cubism, which had its roots in earlier art that we showed you by Braque. But this is from the period from about 1912 to 1914, synthetic cubism. And remember, it's that quote that Picasso said, "Art, after all, is a lie that helps us to understand the truth." So this is part drawing, part painting, part collage of just wallpaper pieces, sheet music, different elements. Here's Le Jeu again, Le Journal, and also that word jouer, to play. You can see this quality of playfulness each time Picasso engages us with trying to represent the real world. And I think that's a great example of how his work is still traditional. He's still trying to help us to understand the truth, but it's experimental in the way that he's telling us straight up, this is a lie. All art is a lie. They also do during this period experimentations with constructed spaces and assemblages, or with materials that were not generally seen as artistic, as like, collage, sheet music, etc., making a guitar like this out of cardboard. This was meant as a maquette and now has been reconstructed, restored, and is in the MoMA in New York. But this was more of a study for a future piece. But this is, Picasso and Braque at the height of Cubism created a whole new art movement, and it changed the game. Artists started to all become Cubist artists. So I want to look at a few examples that are inspired by Picasso and Braque's experiments in Cubism, and we can see their influence, their very modern influence. Cubism becomes all the rage. This is one example of an artist that's influenced by Picasso and Braque, is Raymond Duchamp Villon, and he comes from a family of artists. There are 4 artists in the family of 6 kids. Raymond Duchamp Villon actually died very young. He was killed during World War I. And his work, you can see, is kind of a 3-dimensional. It's called The Horse, but it's kind of a 3-dimensional variation on Cubism, like taking that horse apart and abstracting it. He had some of his other siblings, which we'll talk about as well, but his probably best known, most famous sibling is Marcel Duchamp, and others in the family all took kind of various different names. They either took their mom's name or their dad's name. But here you can see an influence of Picasso and Braque with Cubism. Another really important period here is early studies in abstraction. Remember, we looked at Kandinsky as being thought as the first to do abstraction. This is dated 1912 on the painting, but it was actually finished much after that. So there's a lot of discrepancies on when abstraction started, but a really important husband-wife duo is Robert and Sonia Delaney, and they were really interested in science and optics, ideas of simultaneous contrast that Chevreul had talked about. But Robert Delaney did some experiments with colored discs and would spin them, optics, and look at the illusions that would create the new kind of shapes and colors that happened as a result of these color phenomenon. And he copied them, he mimicked them, even made his canvas circles like those circular optic discs, kind of playing around with color and what color could do perceptually. You can see how this is inspired by Cubism. It's called simultaneous contrast, sun and moon. And you can imagine that this is the sun and the moon, but you can also imagine this as just being pure abstraction, just about colors and shapes. Or if you look directly at the sun, what happens, right? And you start to get those after images that result after staring at the sun, right? So simultaneous contrast is that theory by Chevreul that colors become more intense, colors become more different based upon what you put it next to. So for instance, if you put orange next to red, it looks more orange. But if you put it next to peach, then you're going to start to see the peach as changing, looking more pink, more start to notice that it has maybe more white or yellow in it than the orange does. And Delaney and his wife, Sonia, were really interested in this. So this is his wife, Sonia Delaney, in France, were experimenting with theories of color and shape. Robert Delaney was a little bit older than Sonia Delaney, was more of a seasoned artist, inspired her. They were actually the exact same age, but started in art first. He was influential in Sonia Delaney. They meet, they get married, and she first starts to look at artists that weren't considered fine artists, folk artists. And she actually physically made a quilt and exhibited it as a painting, which I think is just really, really interesting, thinking about modern art, and that art is more of what the artist is intending to do versus what the art actually is. Because if this was a blanket on a bed, we wouldn't think of it as art, perhaps. But if we transform it and put it on a wall and say the artist is now calling this art, then we see it in a different way. So Sonia Delaney is experimenting with Cubism, with forms that are more out of the folk tradition. And she has very, very beautiful work. I think she gets undersold in her importance in terms of the pioneering development of abstraction. The last painting that I'm going to show you is this painting by the very famous artist Marcel Duchamp. We talk about him again in a later chapter. His early work, though, was definitely highly indebted to Picasso and Cubism. This was a work that was exhibited in New York at the very famous Armory exhibition in 1913 that introduced the United States to modern art of Europe, and it really changed a lot of American artists because American artists were a little bit further behind. They were still doing work that was very, very representational. Then they see the show and boom, like an explosion, it starts to shift American art. And New York becomes an art capital, second to Paris and London originally, but then surpasses eventually, kind of becomes a global art capital. But Marcel Duchamp was inspired by by photographs by Muybridge and other that were studies of movement. So that idea of Henri Bergson's thought about an accumulation of experiences to represent an idea of perception, Marcel Duchamp is literally layering those. So when you first look at this, it's abstract, it's cubist, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. But remember, a lot of times a title is an entrance point into the painting. So what's the title? Nude Descending a Staircase, number 2, so it wasn't the first one. Then you start to think, oh, where is the nude? And then you start to realize, here is the head, here's the torso, here's the hip, here's the legs. Here it is again, head, leg, or I'm sorry, head, arm, torso, legs, repeated, boom, 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 superimposed all on the same space of these steps. Indebted to Cézanne, indebted to Picasso, indebted to Cubism. Before Duchamp figures out his own thing, he ends up doing something that's similar to Sonia Delaney in that he just declares art. He says, hey, this isn't a coffee cup anymore. Boom, I'm going to do this to it. I'm going to put it on a pedestal. It's in a gallery. Boom, now it's art. It doesn't matter that it's a coffee cup anymore. It's a work of art because the artist says it's a work of art. He does that with his very famous fountain, which was him taking a urinal and turning it upside down, putting it on a pedestal, say, boom, it's art. It doesn't really matter the artist's source, it's more the idea, right? So it becomes very conceptual. But this is his early work, and we can see how it was indebted to Picasso. Marcel Duchamp is a very, very important artist, but started with a really kind of traditional take on Cubism. So make sure you respond, take notes, fill out by midnight tonight that response. Let me know if you'll have any questions. Tomorrow we're talking about Chapter 8, which is Early Modern Architecture, Chapter 9, European Art After Cubism, and then we'll have our test. No class on Thursday, and then Friday we will have our test. So good luck, study up, peace, see y'all.